So, what really causes a revolution? Is it some inspiring leader, a powerful new idea, or is it just enough people getting angry at the same time? Well, in her groundbreaking book, States and Social Revolutions, the sociologist Theda Skocpol gives a pretty radical answer. It's none of those. She argues that if we really want to understand massive social change, we've got to stop looking at what people intend to do and start looking at the very structure of society itself.
This quote right here is the absolute heart of her argument. It just completely challenges our usual way of thinking, our belief that revolutions are these heroic acts of will. Instead, Skocpol suggests they're more like earthquakes, these huge historical shifts that just happen when very specific, powerful forces all line up, way beyond the control of any one person or group.
And this, of course, leads to the central puzzle of her work. I mean, if revolutions aren't just willed into being by passionate activists, then what forces out there are actually strong enough to completely shatter an old social order and build a new one? That is the big question Skocpol sets out to answer.
To really appreciate just how much of a breakthrough Skocpol's work was, we have to understand what the thinking was before her. For decades, the field was really dominated by what she called voluntaristic theories, which is basically just the idea that human will is the engine of history. So these older theories, they really focused on things like the psychology of the crowd, their frustrations and their anger, or on the appeal of a new ideology or a really charismatic leader. Skocpol comes along and challenges that whole approach. She pushes for a structural perspective, where revolutions are actually the unintended outcome of these huge impersonal forces crashing into one another. They aren't planned, they just erupt when the entire framework of a society breaks down in a very specific and maybe even predictable way.
Okay, so what does this new structural theory actually look like in practice? Well, it all rests on three core principles that completely change the way we analyze revolutions. First, taking a structural perspective means we look at the objective, real-world relationships between classes and governments, not what's going on in people's heads. Second, she says we have to look at the international context. No nation is an island, right? And intense pressure from competing countries is a massive factor. And third, and this is probably her most radical idea, she talks about the potential autonomy of the state. This means the state isn't just some tool that the ruling class uses. Nope. The state is its own organization with its own interests, like winning wars and keeping order, and those interests can even clash with the elites. So the crucial point here is that for Skocpol, a revolution is what she calls a conjuncture. Think of it like a perfect storm. It's this incredibly rare moment when several totally separate historical forces all converge at once. It's not any single thing, but a state crisis, a vulnerable social structure, and international pressures all hitting at the exact same moment. Now, a big theory needs big evidence, and to test her ideas, Skocpol did something really clever. She didn't just look at where revolutions did happen, she also looked at where they didn't. She meticulously compared the successful social revolutions in France, Russia, and China to countries like England and Japan, which managed to modernize without a massive revolutionary upheaval. And her findings were incredibly consistent. That perfect storm for revolution, it required two critical ingredients. First, you needed a deep crisis within the old agrarian state itself, and that was usually kicked off by military or economic pressure from more advanced nations. And second, you needed widespread peasant rebellions that could take advantage of that state crisis to tear down the old order from the bottom up. France, Russia, and China, they had both. The control cases, the countries that modernized without a revolution, they didn't. It's just a brilliant illustration of her structural argument in action. Of all these different factors, Skocpol's analysis of the state is without a doubt her most important and lasting contribution to how we think about this stuff. Yeah, this concept of the state's potential autonomy is just so key. Before Skocpol, a lot of people just saw the state as a puppet of the dominant class. But she argued it's an actor with its own goals. It needs to maintain control, it needs to get resources for its armies and its bureaucrats, it needs to defend its borders. And sometimes trying to achieve those goals, like, say, modernizing to compete with rival nations, puts the state in direct conflict with its own powerful landowning elites. And that's what creates a fatal crack in the foundations of the old regime. So, instead of being this passive arena, Skocpol gives us this amazing image of the state as Janus-faced, like the Roman god with two faces. One face is looking inward, managing its own society and all the class conflicts. The other face is looking outward, competing in the international arena. A revolutionary crisis ignites when that state gets squeezed from both sides at once and just can't manage both fronts anymore.
And what happened after all the dust settled? Well, here's another one of Skocpol's surprising findings. Despite having totally different ideologies, liberty in France versus communism in Russia and China, the outcomes were strikingly similar. All three revolutions ended up producing states that were way more centralized, way more bureaucratic, and honestly, way more powerful than the monarchies they'd overthrown.
So, does a theory about these long-gone agrarian empires really have anything to tell us about our world today? Skocpol believed it absolutely does, even though the path to fundamental change would probably look very different. Now, she's very clear that her specific two-part model, state crisis plus peasant revolt, applies to those pre-industrial agrarian states she studied. But in her conclusion, she does think about how a radical transformation might happen in advanced industrial nations, and it's not through a sudden violent collapse. For modern societies, she suggests that any transformation would have to be a much more gradual process. It would be achieved through a long series of what are sometimes called non-reformist reforms. These are changes that don't just tweak the system, but actually shift power within it. This would take mass political movements pushing to make both the state and the economy more democratic. And crucially, she argues this is only really possible with a shared international commitment to peace, because that removes the state's main justification for having so much coercive power in the first place. Which leaves us with a final, really important question for our own time. Skocpol taught us to look past the daily headlines, to look past the protests and the politicians, and instead to see the deep structural pressures that are shaping our world. So, if revolutions truly come rather than being made, what international economic and political pressures are building on states right now, maybe largely unseen, that could be shaping the transformations of tomorrow?